The parking lot looked creepy. The Barrack apartments were the first in town to have their own parking lot on the lower level, and it wasn't as well lit or well maintained as the newer ones. There was no security, and I didn't detect any cameras. This was odd because there were no access restrictions here either. All the parking spaces were occupied, and there were numerous signs hanging everywhere threatening violators with towing and appropriate fines. The parking lot was located in a non-profit, low-traffic area, so I figured they wouldn't have too much trouble. My thoughts wandered. It was Friday afternoon, and I had been sitting there for 3 hours. My patience was wearing thin. My wife, Carlotta, was upstairs meeting with Charles Henry Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, or CHG as many people called him, is the vice president of Gilbert Mechanics, one of the largest companies in town. I wouldn't call him rich, but he is certainly well-to-do. In fact, compared to me, he's rich. He's also charming, good-looking, and, I imagine, great in bed. So it's not hard to guess why I'm here today. Carlotta and I have been married for 27 years. In high school, I was a mediocre student, and she was just one of the girls. You could say we were a couple of invisible kids going through the system. We dated, and the next year, after high school graduation, we got married. She wanted to move out of her parents' house, and I wanted regular sex. It seemed like a good deal at the time. I got a job as a house painter, and a few years later, I had my own business. We had 2 sons, Tony and Greg, and a daughter, Sharon. We never needed anything, but raising 3 kids meant we never had money to spend on nice things. My kids were the only ones in the neighborhood who never went to Disneyland. We spent a lot of time at Nobles Grove, but it didn't compensate us for the cost. The only vacation spot was the family bungalow on the Little Lehigh River. Carlotta and I always got along well. There was no wild, passionate love like in the movies. We were comfortable together, but I can't say we were madly in love. I felt like that's what real life was all about. After the birth of her children, Carlotta retained almost all of her figure, although her butt had gotten a little bigger. She had an olive complexion and thick, dark hair. When she turned 40, a silver streak of hair appeared on the left side. It was odd, but a little stylish. She combed her hair so that it emphasized her face. I had to admit that she was still a beautiful woman. However, her beauty was offset by her bitter personality. She could never be described as a loving person. Even the children noticed this. As they grew older, Carlotta became angrier and angrier. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, just everything and everyone in general. I had no idea why it was happening. Tony and Greg graduated from high school with the same excellent grades as me. Ha ha! Hell, we can't all be geniuses. They both started working as apprentice masons, and 2 years later they had their own little business. It wasn't too bad. Sharon got married and left as soon as she could. As soon as Carlotta and I were alone in the house, I became a target for her poison. I didn't eat well. I dressed like a slob. I was out of shape. I was stuck in a dead-end job and would never amount to anything. I made her drive a crappy car. We didn't have a retirement plan. It was interminable. I regretted the kids leaving home because I had no one else to share Carlotta's anger with, and then after about a year, it was all over. My loving wife had somehow developed a new interest that changed her character. Instead of constantly pestering me, she now simply ignored me. We still lived together as husband and wife, including sex, but it became almost platonic. She continued to cook meals and keep the house clean, but the sarcasm was gone. In bed, she behaved the same as before, mediocre and indifferent. I can't say it was a bad change, but it made me a little uneasy. I probably should have been glad, but I wasn't. Of course, the new interest in Carlotta's life had to do with Cheech Jenkins. I had no idea where she had met him or under what circumstances. All I knew was that it was a regular and serious relationship. All a woman had to do was ask, and I'd give her a divorce in a minute. She'd get half of everything, which wasn't much. I waited patiently for her to talk to me about it or just surprise me with the papers, but nothing was happening. I guess she was happy with the status quo. There was no way in hell I was going to bring it up or confront her. Everything was going smoothly as long as she felt guilty about cheating. If I made it clear that I knew what was going on, she would probably continue dating him and make my life miserable again. I couldn't take that risk. If she found out I knew about CH and continued to date him, I would be humiliated to the point of possibly hurting her. Then my kids would hate me, and I didn't want that to happen. It was a hell of a dilemma. Carlotta entered the garage alone. She got into her expensive Civic and drove off without noticing my pickup parked in the corner. She needed to get home to get started on dinner. CH usually had dinner out of the house. I pulled my pickup closer to his Lexus and made myself as comfortable as possible. I didn't know much about my wife's lover. He was in his early 40s, and as I said, he was quite good-looking. Every now and then, his picture would appear in the newspapers when he attended some social function. Of course, Carlotta was never with him. One of his most noticeable features was the large ring on the little finger of his right hand. It was a solitaire diamond weighing about 3 carats. Rumor had it that he got a big bonus when he became vice president and blew it all on the ring. After Carlotta and I had been married for about 5 years, I overdid it and gave her a ring that didn't even have half a carat in it. Silly me. I was proud of what I had done. I watched as he walked out of the entryway and headed for his Lexus. He even walked like he was hot shit. I didn't know the guy, but I hated him. As soon as he hit the keyless entry button, I got out of the car. The stun gun hit him before he even got to the door. I wasn't nimble and I wasn't tough, but I absolutely did my job. I grabbed him by both legs and pulled him toward the back door. First he lifted his head and shoulders, and then I turned his legs around. It always looks so easy in the movies, but getting 200 pounds of dead weight into the back of a truck is not easy. First, I secured his legs and arms with duct tape. When it came to his mouth, I went around his head a few times, being careful not to cover his nose. I didn't want the son of a bitch suffocating in the back of my truck. I covered him with a tarp and closed the trunk lid. Before I drove away, I took his keys and locked the Lexus again. 20 minutes later, I called Carlotta and told her I was trying to finish work in Trexlertown and would probably be home late. She grumbled a little, but then kept quiet. By the time I got to the bungalow, it was already dusk. I had already selected and prepared a good spot on the south side. 2 apple trees grew there, and we always talked about planting another one. The container with the new Golden Delicious tree I bought yesterday was next to a huge hole. It was a round hole. There was no way I could dig a grave-shaped hole. You could hear traffic passing by, but you couldn't see the bungalow because of the dense thickets. When I removed the tarpaulin from it, CH was awake. I couldn't tell if he was scared or angry. "Hey, do you know who I am?" His eyes were wide with fear when he nodded yes. "Do you know why you're here?" His eyes darted back and forth. He shook his head from side to side. I smiled, grabbed his legs, and started walking. The back of his head hit the edge of the back door as I pulled him away. He was thrashing back and forth as if he knew what was about to happen, but all he did was wear himself out. I took off his watch and the precious ring on his pinky and put them in my pocket. In addition, his wallet and cell phone went to the front seat of the truck. As I started to push him into the hole, I realized he was afraid. I pushed him inside, and he kept trying to get up, even though his arms and legs were secured. Eventually, I had to hit him on the head with a shovel to get him to calm down. It didn't render him unconscious completely, but it made him manageable. I began to backfill the hole as he curled up into a fetal position. He was still alive, and before I finished backfilling the hole, he came to his senses. By then, he could only make grunting noises. I poured about 3 feet of earth over him, making it impossible for him to escape, and then it finally quieted down. I pulled the new apple tree out of the pot, carefully placed it in the center of the hole, and covered everything around it with a couple of bags of good soil. I used the remaining dirt from the hole to finish the job and then spread 2 bags of mulch on top. It was time to head home. My dinner was cooked in the microwave. My wife stayed close to the TV. It was a quiet evening. I stashed the things I took from CH in the garage. I'll get rid of them later. Carlotta went to bed early, and I spent the night on the couch. It was a busy weekend with leaves to rake and bushes to trim. At least I didn't have to mow anymore. It's quite possible that no one will be going up to the bungalow for the next few months. Carlotta hasn't been up there in years. This will allow the new tree to adapt and not look like it has just been planted. The weekend passed uneventfully and without much happening. Sunday night, I stopped by Redding and got rid of the watch, wallet, and cell phone I had taken from CH. Monday morning came, and I was ready to start a new week. Carlotta looked nervous. I caught her making several fruitless cell phone calls. Everything was going fine until Wednesday when the police showed up at my workplace and escorted me to the police station. Mr. Saunders, do you know why you're here? His name tag read, Lieutenant Detective Williams. The only thing I can assume is that someone didn't like the way I painted his house. That elicited a disgruntled smirk from me. Do you know Charles Henry Jenkins? I know who he is, but I've never met him. Why? Mr. Jenkins is a close friend of your wife, Carlotta. Then perhaps you should talk to my wife. What does this have to do with me? Has he accused me of anything? Mr. Jenkins didn't say anything. Detective Williams was shifting some papers on his desk. Mr. Jenkins didn't show up for work on Monday, and he was last seen on Friday. I don't know what to say. Have you spoken to the man who saw him? Yes, Mr. Saunders. It was your wife. I'm just a little curious. What is my wife's relationship to this Jenkins fellow? And since he's a friend of my wife's, what the hell am I doing here? Detective Williams rose from his chair. Excuse me for a minute. I watched as he left the room and turned to the wall with the large one-way mirror. After a moment, he returned to his chair. Mr. Saunders, your wife has been close friends with Mr. Jenkins for about 6 months now. She visited his apartment regularly and kept clothes and personal hygiene items there. You mean my wife was having an affair with this Mr. Jenkins? Would you like a coffee, Mr. Saunders, or a Coke? Hell no! But I'd like to know where this Jenkins guy is so I can pay him a visit. At least tell me where he lives. The conversation went on from there. The house I was painting in Trexlertown turned out to be an empty apartment. No one could confirm that I had or hadn't been there. In fact, I had painted it the day before. All they had was a phone call I'd made to Carlotta, which pretty much proved nothing. For the rest of the weekend, I never once left my wife's sight. I even made sure I was with people on Monday and Tuesday just in case. After 2 hours, Detective Williams and his co-workers seemed disappointed and told me I could go. I told them that under the circumstances, they should convince my wife to stay elsewhere until I calmed down. They left me sitting in my room for another hour, and finally a patrolman came for me. Carlotta was going to stay with Sharon for a few days. I spent the evening drinking beer and grinning to myself. The next morning, I moved all my stuff into one of the spare bedrooms. I would no longer be sleeping with Carlotta. The next night, Tony, Greg, and Sharon came to talk to me. Their mother confessed to the affair and was very remorseful. It was a mistake, and she never meant to hurt me. It would never happen again. I listened to this nonsense for 30 minutes and tried to be as polite as possible. Once I agreed to let her go home, everyone was happy and smiling. After they left, I drank a few more beers and started smiling again. Carlotta came back to the house the next morning, and my euphoria was short-lived. We never talked about her affair with SN. We didn't talk about anything at all. Our conversations were limited to whatever words were necessary to function. I never accused her of anything, and she never offered an explanation or apology. The police never contacted me again. There were a few small articles in the local papers, and then it all went quiet. However, the situation with Carlotta did not turn out as I had hoped. There was no remorse on her part, and the old anger and bitterness began to return. She had lost her lover and finally realized that he wasn't coming back. I was up early in the mornings and usually had breakfast, lunch, and dinner at one of the local eateries. By the time I got home in the evening, I was always ready to shower and get into bed. Carlotta took care of the house and washed my clothes. I never asked for more than that. We still had joint bank accounts and credit cards, but she never abused any of them. There was no sex between us. The few times we ended up in the same room were tense. All the old teasing, innuendo, and insults returned. I hoped she'd find a new lover and regretted the demise of the first one. Even if she wasn't cheating, she treated me like a cuckold. She knew I was well aware of her affair and did nothing about it. What kind of man is it that finds out his wife is cheating on him and then just lies down and accepts it? Wimp. I could see the contempt in her eyes every time she looked at me. To her, I was nothing. She had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. I was the one in control. It was time to bring her down to earth. The kids were planning to spend Thanksgiving at our house. It seemed like a great idea to me. It would give me a chance to make things right. The kids had already realized that Carlotta was back to her old nasty self, but they didn't know what to do about it. I guess they thought it was my fault. Tony's wife, Greg's wife, Sharon and Carlotta were busy in the kitchen while the men watched the soccer games. I never liked watching sports, but today was something special. I rejoiced when Sharon announced that the food was ready. There were 8 of us at the table. Before the meal begins, someone usually says grace. This time it was suggested that we go around the table and each person say what they were thankful for. It's a silly ritual that seems to have been invented by a family from a TV sitcom. I didn't mind because it would give me a chance to give my wife some grief. Most of the snippets were quite expected. Sharon took the opportunity to announce her pregnancy, which we all knew about in one way or another. When the turn came to me, I smiled and raised my right hand. Everyone got a good look at my shiny diamond ring on my pinky finger. I'm grateful for the magic ring my beloved wife gave me. It gave me the power to make things right. It replaced my sadness with happiness. It washed away my humiliation and gave me pride. It gave me the courage to right a terrible wrong. I am truly grateful for my wonderful and magical ring. There was silence at the table. Carlotta sat motionless, eyes and mouth wide open. The rest of the family didn't notice because they were all looking at me and my ring and trying to figure out what the hell I was talking about. "That's a very pretty ring, Dad. But what does that stupid speech mean?" Terry seemed to think it had an effect, and soon everyone jumped up and started demanding some sort of explanation from me. I just smiled and put my hand back in my lap. I looked at Greg sitting to my right and said, "Your turn." No one noticed as Carlotta stood up and quietly left the room. Everyone but her finished their turn to thank me. Someone made a passing comment about Carlotta's absence, and then everyone got down to eating. Everyone was busy when I got up to look for my wife. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, crying quietly. She was looking at me with an expression that seemed to be a mixture of fear and anxiety. Her eyes were puffy and her cheeks were red. She didn't say anything, but just sat there looking sad. "Carlotta, your family is expecting you to join them. Clean yourself up and join us at the table." That was it. I closed the bedroom door and returned to my guests. 5 minutes later, my wife rejoined the company. Nothing was said about her absence. The rest of the evening passed as expected. I insisted that all leftovers be sent home with the children. The girls helped Carlotta with the cleanup and everything was put away. The boys did nothing but empty a few beer bottles and burp. I waved at the last of them and noticed my wife heading for the bedroom. I watched this with a small smile on my face that was actually a smirk. I felt so damn angry and so redeemed. I drank another mug of beer before heading to my room. The aroma of fresh coffee in the kitchen the next morning was unexpected. Carlotta was fully dressed and ready for a new day. She offered me a fresh cup, which I accepted and politely drank before heading to work. It was a small thing, but it was a start. The contempt in her eyes was gone. It was replaced by a look of cautious respect. It was more of a tolerant look, but it made me a little uncomfortable. It had been a turbulent day at work. I figured I had 1 day, 2 at the most, before the police would come after me. Now that Carlotta knew I had something to do with her boyfriend's disappearance, she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed, and I didn't care. There was no way I was going to keep putting up with her crap. I wouldn't be able to give the authorities a decent explanation for the ring. The next morning, Carlotta made coffee and asked if I wanted scrambled eggs or something. I settled for a toasted English muffin with a little honey. Could this really be my last meal? Would the cops come after me today? There was no talking between us, but there were no unpleasant comments either. The next week started the same way. Tuesday morning, I had French toast. Wednesday morning, she asked me if I could come home early because she planned to make lasagna, my favorite meal. Now I was getting really scared. Christmas was 2 weeks away. I felt extremely uncomfortable. Carlotta was up to something, and I had no idea what it was. I knew I wouldn't like it. When I was a boy, I hated Devil's Food Cake. Everyone else in the family loved it, so my mom made it often. My favorite frosting for the cake was tart lemon cream. In an attempt to appease me, my mom started putting lemon frosting on the Devil's Food Cake. I remember savoring the sweet treat, but I always knew that underneath that treat was that cursed Devil's Food Cake. Carlotta was the cake, and her persona was the lemon icing. Sooner or later, the icing would run out, and I would be left with Devil's Food Cake. By this time, I had already decided that she wasn't going to go to the police and tell them about the ring. She had other plans that probably weren't legal. I couldn't wait any longer. 2 days before Christmas, I cleaned out my bank accounts and canceled my credit cards. There wasn't much there, but I figured I'd take it all. Yes, that's right, I was leaving. No divorce, no legal red tape. I was just leaving. The house was a rental. We were never interested in buying our own. We put up a small Christmas tree with gifts for each of the kids and their spouses. They were going to come over in the afternoon. Unfortunately, I would not see them this year. Early Christmas morning, I put a small box under the tree for Carlotta and quietly left the house for the last time. I drove west until I hit the I-81 freeway and then headed south. I had a friend in Pensacola who was going to shelter me until I found my own place. I stopped near Hagerstown for breakfast. Just then, Carlotta was opening her present. Inside, she would find my engagement ring and a 3-carat diamond ring on my pinky. It was too far to travel in one day, at least for me. Unfortunately, most motels were busy for the holidays. Eventually, I found one near Chattanooga. The next day, I made myself comfortable at the home of my old friend Tom and his wife. There were many furnished mobile homes in the area that were available for rent. Once settled, I got a job with a company that specialized in repairing flood and water damage. They agreed to pay me under the table if I agreed not to give them my Social Security number. It was an interesting arrangement and everyone was happy. I decided it was time to check on my kids. Carlotta was indifferent to me, but the kids needed something to deal with. One of my work colleagues was happy to let me use his cell phone in exchange for lunch. "Terry, it's Dad. What's going on?" "Where the hell are you? This place is such a mess. Mom's going crazy." "Crazy? How? Crazy or crazy with grief?" "Crazy. Christmas was a disaster, but it got worse after that. When she found out you took all the money and canceled the credit cards, she went into a rage." "Well, at least something good came out of it." "What happened? Before Christmas, everything was fine between you two. We all thought things were going to work out between you two." "Terry, it may have seemed that way, but trust me, that's never going to happen. I decided it was best to leave before things turned to hell." "We don't know how long she can last with the money. None of us are in a position to help. Sharon offered to get her a job and Mom blew up. I don't think she has enough money to pay her rent and utilities at the end of the month." "Are you doing anything for her at all?" "We're doing our best to stay away from her. Since she has no one to take it out on, she uses us. Sharon doesn't even pick up the phone when she calls. Even if we could help, it's getting to the point where none of us want to do it." "Well, I'm sorry to leave you with this mess, but you guys insisted I take her back after she cheated on me, so now you have to live with it." "Are you sure you don't want to go home?" "No way, I have a job and a good place to live. Next week I'm going to buy myself an HD TV and a couple beers. Life is good for me." "Where the hell are you? My phone shows El Paso." "That's not my phone. Don't try to call me back on this number. It won't work. I'll call you again in a couple weeks. Say hi to Greg and Sharon for me." I was glad things were going well at home. The kids were having a hard time, but they were coping. My only problem now was deciding whether I should buy a 32 or 37-inch TV. Decisions, decisions, decisions. There was plenty of work for painters in the area. All the contractors were licensed, but no one seemed to care about the workers. It was easier to look past it. As long as the work got done and there were no complaints, everything was fine. I got a TV and a small microwave. I was in heaven. I was making enough money to live on, so I didn't have to touch the cash I brought with me. I bought a discarded cell phone and called Terry 3 weeks later. "Dad, I'm glad you called. Mom's in jail." "What the hell is your mom in jail for?" "Remember that ring you showed everyone at Thanksgiving?" "Yeah, what about it?" "You said you got it from your mom, right?" "Right. Why?" "Well, Mom needed money and she tried to pawn it. She got arrested at the pawn shop 10 minutes later." "Damn, that's rough. Why did they arrest her?" "You know perfectly well, don't you?" I didn't answer, but I think he heard me snicker. "Mom told the police she got the ring from you, but they didn't believe her. It would have been hard for the cops to pin anything on Carlotta just because of the ring. They had no body, no murder weapon, no motive, no witnesses. What the hell were they going to charge her with? Having her boyfriend's ring?" Terry, I'll call you back in a week. I don't know what to do right now. Let me think about it for a while. I spent a few hours at the computers at the public library. There were several articles in the Reading Eagle newspaper related to the investigation into the disappearance of Charles Henry Jenkins. The biggest sensation they got was when Carlotta tried to pawn his ring. She claimed that I had given it to her and then disappeared. When I next called Terry, he told me that he had assured the authorities that I was fine and I just wanted to get away from Carlotta. They spent a few days with my wife and said they understood my reasoning but still wanted to talk to me. Terry had a phone number for me to call. Later that week, I drove to Biloxi and called the Reading Police Department. It wasn't the conversation they wanted, but they seemed satisfied with my answers. I simply told them that after finding out that my wife had cheated on me, I felt that I could no longer live with her. Leaving was the only way I could maintain some self-respect. I guess they just needed to fill in some blank squares in their investigative report. Before heading home, I called Sharon. All my calls were directed to Terry because he was the oldest and, I thought, the most poised. She was glad to hear from me and immediately told me to call Greg later that evening. The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Carlotta, so they let her go. Sharon told me that Carlotta loaded into a car and left to go to her sister's house in Frackville. Carlotta refused to communicate with the children and told them to rot in hell. Easter vacation was spent together at Disneyland, all of us except Carlotta. Sharon was 5 months pregnant, but still enjoyed herself. I had denied my kids this when they were younger, but now they all seemed to enjoy it. The airfare and entrance fees took all the money I got when I left, but it was worth it. I lost my wife, but I still have my family. Ned, someday I'll have to go back to the family bungalow and look at that golden, delicious apple tree. Someday.